Greetings and welcome to day 2 of the 5th annual Riva and David Logan Symposium on the Artist Book. For those of you tuning in for the first time, I'm Steve Woodall, collection specialist for the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, where I work with the Riva and David Logan collection of illustrated books. Normally, we would be gathered at the Legion of Honor Museum here in San Francisco. But as I said yesterday, we're going to make the most of the platform we have. We welcome those attendees from across the US, Canada, and elsewhere who wouldn't have been able to attend had the symposium be in person here in San Francisco. Our symposium is dedicated to the memory of the great collectors, Riva and David Logan of Chicago, whose 1998 gift made the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts stewards of a significant collection of livres d'artistes and artist books, including 16 of the 21 books Iliazd published in Paris from 1923 to 1974. The purpose of this symposium is to take a deep look at the work of a greatly under-recognized 20th century artist. It's important to know that Iliazd was a true book artist, a pioneer in separating the form conceptually from the context it inherited. He used the book as an expressive form in its totality, the product of a singular vision. And it is in that sense that his books stand out from the typical French livre d'artiste. I think this says it best. Louis Bonnier, who worked closely with Iliazd for decades as director of the letterpress print studio where Iliazd books were typeset and printed, once went on to compare him to a great film director with film stars there to serve the director's vision. Johanna Drucker yesterday talked about Louis Bonnier, and he was an important person in Iliazd's creative process. His comparison to film directors is an apt comparison. Jean-Paul Belmondo, for example, was a major film star, but Breathless will always be thought of first as a Godard film. Likewise, the books Iliazd made with major stars of the art world, Iliazd will always be the auteur of his books. No matter how great the artist, they were there to serve Iliazd's vision, and they willingly accepted that role. Once again, we thank the Logan Family Foundations for supporting our work here at the museum, and we are especially grateful to John Logan, who has been our great advocate and supporter through his foundation, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation. They have made this year's symposium possible, as well as a related website, which is soon to be released. To have a look at our previous websites, you can make a note of this link, insights.fansf.org. For those of you who weren't with us yesterday, you should find a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen for submitting questions or comments, and that is where you can also find a link to instructions for closed captioning. This is a new feature for us. We're using it for the first time, and we're going to see how it works for these symposiums. It would be great to have. We also will be able to have translations available in French and also in Russian. As for the pop-up questions and Q&A, you can type those in. Our presenters may be able to answer these right in the pop-up window, but we may also take them up in the roundtable discussion following our 3 presentations today. And if you missed yesterday, the symposium will be available next month in its entirety on the museum's YouTube channel, and we will send out notification to all when that is posted. I'm also going to post right here my email address for any other questions you may have about any of this, including the 30% discount to you all, discount that is available from Johns Hopkins University Press on Johanna Drucker's new meta-biography of Iliazd. So if you need information about that, let me know. With that said, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker. Andrei Ustinov studied at the University of St. Petersburg and received his PhD from Stanford University, writing and publishing mostly in Russian. He has been engaged in research of the Russian avant-garde for more than 30 years. With University of Toronto professor Leonid Livak, he co-authored The Russian Literary Avant-Garde in Paris, 1920-1926, published, unfortunately, just in Russian in Moscow in 2018. His monograph, École de Paris in Russian poetry, is dedicated to émigré participation in the Parisian Dada movement. Andrei has been a great resource for me in research for our forthcoming website, and he has helped fill in numerous details on Iliazd and the émigré community. You will have to imagine thunderous applause when I say, please welcome Andrei Ustinov.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction. All right. Since he arrived in Paris, Ilia Zdanévich vigorously involved himself in the activities of local artistic life. He gave a series of lectures on contemporary Russian poetry and sparked real interest in its goals and objectives. Wrote Serge Romov in the magazine Udar, meaning strike, in early 1923. 4 volumes of The Strike that Romov edited and printed at Typographie l'Union, where he worked, created quite a stir in both Paris and Berlin, main cultural centers of Russian immigration. Contemporary Russian poetry, or as Romov explained further, new Russian literary traits that Zdanevich introduced to his French audience, was a new wave of Russian literary experiment that was taking place at that time in Paris. Romov was an uncompromising organizer of non-conventional Russian poets and artists, who were but a few in the vast literary diaspora in France and elsewhere. Also, he successfully served as a conduit in these poets' interactions with their Parisian counterparts. In particular, he organized a series of exhibitions on the Boulevard de Montparnasse, including a notorious Les Sons du Parnasse and a few others. With Zdanevich's arrivals, he, however, took a step back to put Zdanevich onto the stage in representing what we defined with Leonid Livak in our book as Russian literary avant-garde in Paris. Yet, for some participants of that movement, Boris Poplavsky, Boris Bozhnev, and Serge Charchun, literary was inseparable from artistic, poetry inseparable from art. As Zdanevich later recalled in his memoirs, when he arrived in France, Boris Poplavsky was still undecided whether to be an artist or a poet. What was important was that being a nominal association, somewhat the fellowship of the Russian avant-garde, this young man's literary activities clashed with the emigre establishment. They just did not fit with the general refugee population for whom the idea of art and poetry was of utterly conservative, terribly traditional, and ideologically charged nature. They wanted to experiment with words and pains, and found in Zdanevich a seasoned warrior who readily assembled his Zaum troops and led them in battle as soon as he stepped on the French soil. When he arrived around November 12, 1921, together with another poet, Vladimir Sveshnikov, whom he befriended in Istanbul, considered his mentor, and commemorated warmly in his novel, The Futurist Philosophy, Zdanevich immediately plunged himself in artistic parties and gatherings. Most likely, he made his first public appearance only in a couple of days, after being in Paris only for a couple of days, meeting at a soiree in Russian cabaret, the Chamber of Poets, with his friends from Tiflis, a Georgian artist, Lado Gudiashvili, and possibly Vera Sudeikina, for whom he once created a special cape for her dress with the Zaum poem written on both sides, on one side in French, on the other in Russian, and her husband, Sergei Sudeikin, a famous decorator and stage designer. In less than 2 weeks, another artist, Mikhail Larionov, arranged for Zdanevich's first public lecture at the salon of Marie Olenin-Dalheim in a fancy Parisian suburb of Passy. For the time being, Zdanevich settled at Mikhail Larionov and Natalia Goncharova's apartment in the 6th arrondissement. It is indeed these two major figures of the 20th century art who immediately took as their task to bring Zdanevich into the Parisian artistic world in the most expedited fashion. Goncharova and Larionov discovered Zdanevich back in 1910s, supported him in his even most provocative endeavors, including his lecture on his boot as an objet d'art, and an objet d'art more than Venus de Milo. In 1913, Zdanevich authored a monograph on Goncharova's and Larionov's groundbreaking artistic philosophy under a pen name Eganiburi, which meant reading Cyrillic spelling of Zdanevich, including a hard point at the end, as if they were Latin letters. As soon as he arrived to their house, he immediately composed an essay titled Mikhail Larionov that he even marked with the address of their apartment, 43 Rue de Seine. A year later, he wrote a manifesto for the opening of the Goncharova-Larionov exhibition at the Kingware Gallery in New York, and tried to publish it in the famed The Little Review, but could not find a translator. Zdanevich's lecture, Nouvelle École dans la Poésie Russe, New Schools in Russian Poetry, was presented with the assistance of Larionov on November 27th, and capitalized on his experience of public provocation that he perfected in Tiflis. Zdanevich named Victor Hugo and Honoré de Balzac as his teachers, saying that contemporary Russian poetry is fascinated with their collective genius, and therefore he decided to send invitations to his own lecture, not to the writers who were dead by then, but to their monuments. Similar to what Russian futurists did when they were posting letters to the Pushkin monument in Moscow. I am a poet, stated Zdanevich, and I behave as a poet should. An invitation to the soirée sent to a monument is poetry itself. Precisely, because from the point of view of reason, it is nothing but a fallacy, a delusion. But if there was no fallacy, nothing would have existed, not even the universe. In his lecture, Zdanevich spoke of new developments in Russian poetry since Futurism, mentioning his own movement called Всечество, everythingness, and proclaiming himself a forerunner of European modernism in the following passage. Guillaume Apollinaire has not visited yet Typographie l'Union at the Boulevard Saint-Jacques, when poets Lotov and Sergeyev were already writing Rayanist, Luchitsky, Rayanist poems, creating amazing typographic compositions in Moscow, long before Le Calligramme. The majority of the statement has to be taken with a grain of salt. Luchism or Rayanism was invented by Larionov before he started collaborating with Zdanevich, while poets Lotov and Sergeyev never existed. However, the main impetus for his lecture happened to be propaganda of the literary and performance collective, the 41st degree, 41 gradus, named after the latitude of Tiflis and led by a triumvirate of Alexei Kruchonych, who at the time was a butt for all jokes about futurism, Igor Terentiev, who failed to emigrate to Paris together with Zdanevich and had to return from Istanbul back to Russia, and Zdanevich himself. He declared that while he is in Paris, he will continue to instill the main principles of that collective, Zaum, or translational language, invented by Velimir Khlebnikov, whom Zdanevich called a pioneer of the word as such, Остранение, or estrangement, a term borrowed by Zdanevich from the vocabulary of the Russian formalists. And finally, his favorite, Zdvig, or displacement, promoted by Russian futurists and their theories, especially Roman Jakobson. By Zdvig, or displacement, Zdanevich meant deformation of the word's meaning, which inevitably had to follow any infringement on the mass of the word at any level, whether phonetic, morphological, or syntactic. Without a doubt, Zdvig should be considered a favorite literary device of Zdanevich, profoundly used by him in creation of dra, or dramas, including the last of the five, Lidantiu Faram, Lidantiu to the Lights, printed at l'Union in 1923 with a fabulous cover of Naum, Sam the Cowboy Granovsky. Georges Raymond de Seigne, a famous Dadaist theoretician and poet, wrote in his memoir Déjà jadis ou du mouvement Dada à l'espace abstrait that Iliazd was at that time sympathetic, dynamic, possessing a great Russian charisma, all breathing with innovation. He preserved that enthusiasm that Dada has already lost. One could meet Iliazd at La Rotonde with Serge Charchoun or Michel Larionov or Serge Futinsky or Lado Gudiashvili, reminiscent Lucien Scheller in Iliazd du Mont Caucase à Montparnasse. But only at dawn, in the Café Camille, one could surely find that Georgian Dadaist without a mistake. This was where he preferred to hold the sessions of his L'Université du Degré 40, the University of the 41st degree. After 1923, when Café Camille, Zdanevich's headquarters, was turned into a popular nightclub and American bar, Le Jockey, Zdanevich changed his regular hangout to Café La Bollée, located in a cellar at 25 Rue de l'Hirondelle, just a few blocks from Place Saint-Michel. This was where he performed his eclogue Iliazda, or the Iliad according to Ilia Zdanévich, the poster for which, printed by Romov at l'Union, was demonstrated yesterday by Johanna and Tim. The further activities of Zdanevich in Paris are represented in detail in our book with Leonid Livak, where we followed in the footsteps of Annick Lionel Marie's Iliazd Facette d'une Vie, but we also introduced documents from major archival collections, including Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. For example, Zdanevich's letter to Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, written in the end of December 1921. He sent the program of his lecture, New Schools in Russian Poetry, and wrote to Marinetti that he was planning to hold regular meetings of the L'Université du Degré 40 at another cafe, La Closerie de Lilas, the famous hangout of Ernest Hemingway and Tristan Tzara, even Vladimir Lenin, where he was bragging that French faculty of the university, as well as the Russian faculty, will be so eager to introduce our works of poetry. On January 18, 1922, he signed a copy of his draft Yanko Krul Albanski, Yanko the King of Albanians, to my mentor and a great connoisseur of art, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, a gift from Ilia Zdanévich. In all his lectures presented at his university, Zdanevich attempted to introduce a new iteration of Russian futurism that was radically different from the times of a slap in the public's face and the victory over the sun. The futurism he spoke of went through the Great War, the revolutions, the Civil War, massive immigration, and creation of Russian diaspora as a social and cultural phenomenon. Obviously, there was new futurism in Soviet Russia that was headed by Vladimir Mayakovsky and would be soon reintroduced by him as Lev, the left front of arts. However, for Russian emigres, futurism was like a red cape for a bull, as it was synonymous with the Bolshevism. Already in early 20s, futurism was pronounced in emigre press a triumphant art, the art of the victorious and vicious clique of the Bolsheviks, and Mayakovsky was unconditionally proclaimed as its leading protagonist and therefore a major foe. Also, Zdanevich had to consider the Parisian Dada, because this is what Romov and his circle of poets were perceiving as the cutting edge of contemporary poetry. He was barely familiar with the movement at the time, although later he claimed that he learned of Dada from Ladu Gudashvili's letters to his brother Kirill, also an artist. After listening to his lectures at the university, Georges Redmond de Seine stated in his preface to Let Them Two to the Lights that this pathos of destruction of generally accepted ideas and familiar conventions, eradication of everything dearest to us, unifies l'Université du 40 ans and Dada. In January 1922, Zdanevich wrote a letter to Francis Picabia, where he stated his intentions to stay away from the political agenda. Just like Romov and his group, his personal discord with the White Guard emigration, as he called it, was of aesthetic order. Their true belief in the experiment in art, the power of literary innovation, was expressed by Zdanevich in his interview with Raymond Cognac in the newspaper La Comédie. I left Russia because it became impossible to work in new art there. The rest of the world did not know about our work because we lived in isolation. I believe that it will be in Paris where there will quickly rise that interest in the sonorous and translational or Zaum poetry that lives unconsciously in all of you, in all of us. He tried his best to avoid any possible interactions with White Guard emigration, but could not help himself with the provocations. A major one came in June 1924 when 125th anniversary of Alexander Pushkin's birthday was celebrated. This was the biggest and most profound literary event imaginable. The words "Pushkin is our everything," ascribed to Fyodor Dostoevsky, resonated throughout the Russian diaspora. The celebration of Pushkin's birthday had another hidden agenda: to unify emigres in their mission, the message of which would now read, "We are not in exile, we are the messengers of real Russia." Pushkin festivities in Paris centered around a big gathering planned at Sorbonne Université on June 12, 1924, with the participation of all the stalwarts of White Guard immigration and all other public figures. The cultural occasion was taking shape of an ideologically charged event. So, in order to remind of its literary nature, some of the Pushkin scholars were invited as well. Obviously, Zdanevich was not among the invited, but he came forward nevertheless. He submitted a speech to the organizing committee and, of course, was rejected. However, I believe that Zdanevich knew about that outcome all along, as he never expected to give the speech in public. He planned this as a perfect Dadaist gesture, even though by that time the movement ceased to exist. Zdanevich's celebration speech was written in complete accordance with the Dada canon, as he eradicated decades of writing about Pushkin, stripped public knowledge to its bare, and demanded for a new outlook on the most famous Russian poet. The only thing he omitted from his speech was Zaum. All other aspects of a literary coup d'etat were present and even personalized, because Zdanevich described Pushkin as he would have described himself. In his biography, this speech in defense of Pushkin also carried the weight of a paramount, defining, and ultimate decision that he made. It was a manifesto of demarcation, of his complete separation from the White Guard emigres. He found himself at odds with them a year earlier, when together with Romov and Boris Bozhnev, he started a new literary and artistic collective with an odd name to the Russian ear, Cheris, meaning through. Although the name was just a variation on the name of the German literary group Jerk. Cheris meant to go through borders or over the barriers to establish cultural alliance with Mayakovsky and his collaborators at the left front of art. Mayakovsky came to Paris for a week. On November 24th, 1922, Zdanevich and Romov organized a banquet honoring the poet at the restaurant on Boulevard de Port-Royal, inviting, among other guests, the former Dadaists. They used this occasion also to introduce Cheris and announce a cultural and literary program of the association. When Mayakovsky came to Moscow, he put together a list of his own association of the left front of arts that included the foreign wing, which listed names of the Cheris co-founders, as well as Tristan Tzara and Fernand Léger. Zdanevich used the opportunity to meet with Mayakovsky again when he went back to Berlin to prepare a publication of his new book, Poetry. So Zdanevich came to Berlin to give a talk at the Berlin House of Arts. For his evening of the Zaum, or translational poetry, on December 8th at Café Leon, he organized the performance of his draw, Yanko, the King of Albania, and the panel of speakers, which included Viktor Shklovsky, one of the founders of the Russian formalism, who was living at the time in exile in Berlin. Shklovsky gave a talk on the topic, Zdanevich and Pushkin. Cheris formulated its main objectives in a very straightforward fashion: to establish close communication with young French poets and artists, and to build the ties with Russian artists and poets in Soviet Russia, to introduce them to French culture. The most successful public happening organized by Cheris was the Soirée du Poète Boris Bozhnev that took place on April 29, 1923 at the Galerie La Licorne, and put together Russian and French avant-garde poets and artists, having Romov, Poplavsky, and Bozhnev himself on Russian side, while French participants included Paul Éluard, Vincent Widobro, Raymond de Seine, Philippe Soupeau, Tzara, and Antonin Artaud. Zdanevich presented performance of his another draw, Осел на прокат, S for hire, while a Romanian dancer and a friend of Tzara, Lizița Codreanu, performed a little ballet inspired by Zdanevich's other draw, Ostrov Paschi, Easter Island. At that time, Zdanevich preferred to consider Cheris a literary section of the Union of Russian Artists in Paris, with which he got involved seemingly more than was expected. In 1925, he became a secretary of the union and started his drift from art and literature to ideology. That created an obvious rupture with his comrades in Cheris. As soon as the Soviet Union opened its embassy in France, Zdanevich wholeheartedly embraced the change in political relations, justifying it, I guess, by having his brother Kirill living in the Soviet Tbilisi. This is when he actually wrote to him. After the recognition of the USSR by France, the General Meeting of the Union of Russian artists in Paris on January 15 adopted a resolution on its loyalty in relation to the USSR. At present time, some of the members of the Union made statements about obtaining the Soviet citizenship. The Union also strives to become the artistic center of the Soviet colony in Paris. Then he went even further and applied for a job in the newly opened Soviet embassy, obtaining a position of the consul's secretary. In that case, that was not a Dadaist gesture. That was a genuine surrender. Any reputation, however scandalous he might have had before that, was completely eviscerated. Worse, by taking that political path, he alienated his comrades in arms, who could not forgive his betrayal of ideals of pure art and poetic experiment. It is still not very clear what actually happened to Zdanevich and whether his decision to break with the Russians in Paris, including very close to him Bozhnev and Poplavsky, who were so dear to him, was it really calculated or made out of sheer stupidity? But to give him a benefit of the doubt, I may speculate that perhaps this metamorphosis from Ilia Zdanévich, a witty and unconventional conversationalist, a creator of sound works, and generous organizer of the fêtes and balls like Bal Travesti Transmental, into Iliazd, an artist typographer, happened because of disillusionment and despair. It took at least a dozen years for Zdanevich to make his return back to the Russian fold. In January of 1937, Boris Bozhnev sent him a warm letter from his seclusion in Clamart that started with a poem, «Три пальца кукиш и три пальца крест, и кукишем ты крестишь футуристов, через монокль читая манифест, за кафедрой насмешлив и неистов. Three fingers make a curse, and three fingers make a cross, and you baptize the futurists with your three fingers, reading a manifesto through a monocle at the pulpit, mocking and vehement. Dear Ilia Mikhailovich, wrote Bozhnev, going through my old poems, etc., I found mine your portrait, this poem in 4 verse. Then since this is my portrait, is of you, I am sending it to you. It will remind you of the times when we were all young, and especially the one who was young then was you. It was indeed Bozhnev who helped Zdanevich to reestablish milieu in the post-World War II Paris. In March 1945, he convinced the editors of the first postbellum newspaper, Chestny Slon, an honest elephant. The title refers to the Russian proverb, как слон в посудной лавке, like an elephant in the china shop, to lift the stigma from Zdanevich's name and publish his poem. The poem was Rahel II, that was signed in Russian by Zdanevich with his new literary and artistic name, Iliazd. I'm going to read this poem in Russian because I want to have a segue in Thomas Kitson talk, and I know that he translated it into English, so maybe he will honor us by reading his English translation of this poem. Меня слепого видишь ли, луна? Пускай твоя линяет позолота. Сойди, красавица, ко мне в болото, на дно из раковин и валуна. Моя судьба была вообще ясна. Нет в жизни ничего, помимо гнета. Подчас любви безрадостной тенета и переход без отдыха и сна. Не жить, не умереть, а только ждать, когда проникнет в сердце благодать, глухая ночь настанет голубой, и свидимся в последний раз с тобой. Мой вечный враг, всегдашняя подруга, без ненависти, не любя друг друга. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. And we're going to move on to Thomas Kitson in just a moment. Thomas J. Kitson is a translator, and he is coming to us today from his home in New York City. His 2017 translation of Iliazd novel Rapture, published by Columbia University Press, won a special mention from the 2018 Russia Prize jury. And I'm just going to show, I don't know, can you see me? I guess my screen is up. This is the book, and I highly recommend it. It is worth the price of the book for the foreword alone. It's an extremely informative, lengthy foreword that Thomas has written to this, and it is highly recommended. Thomas also received a 2019 translation fellowship from the NEA for his work on another novel by Iliazd, Philosophia. Thomas holds a PhD in Russian literature from Columbia University, and we are very fortunate to have been able to commission Tom for translations of Russian material in Iliazd books into English for the first time. That's very exciting for us, and we will make those available on our forthcoming website. We are going to release a second wave of online material in greater depth after the first release of the website, so you will likely find most of that there. We think translation is critical to understanding Iliazd's work, and it's especially important for the English-speaking world to have access to these translations. We're also working on acquiring French translations of much of Iliazd's material published in French. But it's been, in the meantime, it's been a great pleasure to work with Thomas Kitson. So please join me. A hearty round of applause for Thomas Kitson.
Thank you, Steve. I'm extremely grateful that you have involved me in this whole project. And thank you to Andrei for your talk. And I definitely learned some stuff from there. And it should be clear to anyone who reads the introduction to Rapture that large portions of that introduction are indebted to Andrei's work. Especially the book with Leonid Livak. Since Andrei, I didn't know whether Andrei was going to read both sonnets from Rahel or only one. Since he read only the second one, I'll read the translation from that one. These are all works in progress, but anyway, here they go. I'm gonna put up go to my sharing screen right now. So that people can see also the page. And let's go to the start. This is the first sonnet from Rahel with the woodcuts by Leopold Sauvage. And this is Rahel 2. This is the poem that Andrei read. Me sightless, tell me, can you see me, moon? Let it all fade away, your honey gilding. Come down, my beauty, to my water logging, to bottom without shells or cobbles strewn. My destiny was bright, but all in vain. In life, there's not a thing save what is galling. From time to time, a cheerless love's entangling and marching without sleep or rest from pain. We neither live nor die, but only wait for moments when the heart is pierced by grace. For muted night to fall a dovish blue, and for the last time I should meet with you, eternal foe, perpetual lady, other, less hatred, yet not loving one another. Iliazd wrote poetry all his life. The first poetry he published in the form of Zaum plays written in a transrational beyond sense language where sounds evoke all at once a complex of contradictory associations, meaningful before the intervention of conscious understanding. The first poetry he published was in the form of Zaum plays, written in a trans-rational, beyond-sense language where sounds evoke all at once a complex of contradictory associations, meaningful before the intervention of conscious understanding. The late poetry he wrote in Russian while living in France and published only in books of his own design looks very different. It was highly formal, always in iambic pentameter, and more often than not in cycles of sonnets. My talk today is prompted by the question, why did Iliazd place these Russian poems prominently in books he knew would end up almost entirely in the hands of readers unable to read his texts? The point of what I want to say in answer is, I think, rather simple, so I'll state it outright. Iliazd had a deep faith in cosmic order and took delight in learning to read the signs that gradually reveal that order. In practical terms, learning to read entails repeated failures to understand, and there's always some portion of mystery left over, even as hope for complete revelation draws readers on. Delight and disappointment are inseparable. As a person who made things in the oldest sense of the word poet, Iliazd created art to appeal to readers with the same curiosity, patience, perseverance, and longing. His works promote an ethics of fidelity to an order too complex to understand, a fidelity expressed in the work of trying against all odds to understand. And Iliazd's work retains secrets, the illegible Russian poems, for instance, that awaken a curiosity that ascribes meaning to mystery and tries to solve it. The secret is in motion, as we learn from Iliazd's novel Philosophia. There are suggestive precedents for this kind of fidelity, especially in medieval writing. Here is a page from the Alphabet Prayer by Konstantin of Preslav, an early Bulgarian writer. The Cyrillic alphabet appears in acrostic, reading the cinnabar initials of each line. The red letters here are all representing the letters of the alphabet. Another work, Constantine's translation of Greek Byzantine hymns into Church Slavonic, much too long to show you, conceals as an acrostic in the same form an entire original Slavonic hymn that's written according to all the proper Byzantine metrics. Constantine's hymn was known only to God, so to speak, until the 1980s, more than 1,000 years after he composed it, and too late, as it turns out, for Iliazd to know this particular example, but it's just the kind of story he loved to collect. Iliazd is different, however, because he openly encourages us to search. His Russian poems, after all, are not invisible. He trains us to expect revelations and wants to keep us in motion within the confined space of a work until it comes to contain an entire cosmos. It's worth recalling that Iliazd did not publish his books in the sense of exposing them to the public in order to convey information. They were mise en lumière, brought to light and intended to inform the mind, as Françoise Legris wrote in her 1984 study. They expose an initiate to the light as in a mystery cult, where the fundamental knowledge gained must remain unspoken. Still, first among the poet's tools is language that advances particular themes and can be parsed. And there are numerous places in Iliazd's Russian poems where he very nearly openly declares himself. I've taken the title for my talk from one of those places in Iliazd's Pismo, the letter, published in 1948 with engravings by Picasso. The poem's title suggests there's a message to be received, and it's written in the persona of a condemned man addressing his lady love on the eve of his execution. But since the title can also be read simply as writing, it deals with all kinds of readable signs, the intertwined marks of individual fates and cosmic order. The poem is written in 72 quatrains of iambic pentameter with a constant rhyme scheme. It's also, characteristically for Iliazd's late poems, printed all in capital letters and without punctuation. So there's a visual regularity to the pages of the poem, uninterrupted by any of Picasso's engravings. Here is the penultimate stanza. Before long, I myself must be uprooted. Grace shoots through all the world and pins it fast. Do not suspect that's a reproach I've mooted. I've waited while alive, I'll wait to last. The condemned man is certain of two things, imminent death and transformative grace. Or maybe they're one thing. Grace, like all good things in Iliazd's cosmos, is equivocal. It is blessedness, joy, and beauty, but it is also violent, penetrating, arresting, fateful, and sometimes fatal. It's the rapture of Iliazd's 1930 novel. Death and grace are so close, the poet moves to fend off the suspicion that he's complaining about his situation. In the quatrain's final line, the whole notion of expectation turns into something sublime. Fatal grace is not a permanent fixing. It's surely momentous, but it's neither the full revelation nor the end of the search. Waiting for the ultimate consummation continues into eternity. And now here's the final stanza. It's not for nothing that we prayed agreement. In waking life, the strong man fate says part, and yet when in the grave, I'll feel fine dreaming. Please don't, poor lady, please don't cry, my heart. The poem sustains the waiting. It doesn't give us the consummation, even as the poet asserts that the couple's prayers are not vain. Iliazd's version of eternal harmony reflects pantheistic scenarios and dream states described earlier in this poem, explorations of infinite cosmic duration and infinite psychic depth. Harmony, order is present. The human adventure is in discovering our changing modes of partaking. The poet imagines for the lovers a classical apotheosis, shining among the stars of heaven. He chants the refrain, "This is us," as he identifies the lovers with natural phenomena where opposites coincide, like fire and water in a violent storm. Each of these images is a grace, a transformation, death and resurrection. I think it's no insult to say Iliazd's themes are as old as dirt, and the form, iambic pentameter, is nearly as old. Yet it is fertile, it feeds new life. The themes and forms are also a tool. They have a communicative force that comes to the poet's aid to amplify or complicate what the language seems to advance. When Iliazd takes up traditional rhyme and meter, especially the sonnet, he enlists an entire fund of generic memory that extends far beyond the Russian language he writes in, even as strict form gets in the way of translating ostensibly clear meanings. Let's look again at the printed page from the letter. Iliazd's verses are arranged in orderly quatrains that convey a measure of solemnity to the reader who cannot read them. If the reader has an opportunity to hear them read aloud, as we just heard Andrei do earlier, and we can see also from these little promptings Iliazd has put at the bottom of the page that he intends these to be read aloud, their rhymes and rhythms will convey the kind of poetry Iliazd has written. As we can see from the first page of the poem Wordless Sentence, an intricate crown of sonnets published with Braque and Giacometti in 1961, this effect is even more pronounced when Iliazd writes sonnets. There's no way, of course, and this is worth keeping in mind, to distinguish a genuinely solemn performance from nonsense poetry like Lewis Carroll's when we judge solely from visual and auditory criteria. So for those who are not Russian speakers listening to Andrei read the poems, there's not a really good way of distinguishing that from a rhymed and metered poem by Lewis Carroll. The right-hand justified lines here on this side and the more free-floating last tercet show us that Iliazd is meddling with a sonnet tradition that's already notable for the variety of legitimate permutations. Altering strict form is, of course, yet another way for the poet to make meaning. If we look more closely again at the final stanzas of the letter, we notice that Iliazd also twists those old as dirt themes, conventional topoi, into something surreally absurd and quite contemporary. The lover waiting patiently for his beloved is here exaggerated into eternal expectation. The sleep of death is taken perhaps over literally, and yet when in the grave, I'll feel fine dreaming. In Wordless Sentence and Afat, Iliazd's first book with Picasso, Iliazd uses the form to bring disparate materials into relation. His syntax, often difficult, especially in the absence of punctuation, raises a jumble, a midden heap to sort through. His speech registers shift wildly from archaisms to highly colloquial expressions. Here is a rather classically organized sonnet from Afat, 19th of June. The typewriter strikes letters, but they're fuzzy. It mostly takes a break under a bag. The paper inches through like it's a drag. My fancy's at its pinnacle and frozen. The while on high upstairs under the beams, a stringent painter coats the attic spandrels. There Pablo graves on copperplate expanses with golden, confident, and steady beats. But yours the beauty brought into accordance, the artistry up top of stubborn force, with Seller's weak-willed philosophic cadence. It will not from the paper's face be blotted, won't tire of swimming in a stream of verse, will come to rest on an engraving's bottom. I've tried to preserve Iliazd's jarring moves from the conversational "it mostly takes a break" and "it's a drag" to archaic turns of phrase like "the while" for meanwhile, and inversions like "but yours the beauty," on up to the high-sounding "it will not from the paper's face be blotted." The contrasts underline the sonnet's purport, the muse uniting different arts and temperaments, and even temporalities, in the work we are presently reading. Notice also the sonnet's overt concern with establishing or failing to establish rhythms, striking, dragging, freezing, beats, cadences, and with occupying space, cellars versus attics, pinnacles and, okay, graves, expanses of copper plates, streams of verse with a surface and a bottom. It might be simply about the metered organization of the page. In fact, Andrei Markovich suggests, after examining Iliazd's notebooks, that when he composed, he was most concerned with stress patterns and the distribution of vowels across the sonnet's framework before any discernible semantic meanings begin to emerge. Here again, we are balanced with the old practitioner of Zaum on the edge of nonsense. And I think this insight contributes to our understanding of the way Iliazd designs his books. At every level of his work characterized by closure, like a sonnet, he sends us up and down, forward and back, observing obvious rhymes and patterns, then exploring what impedes and impels us in order to identify new patterns and associations, some completely baffling. Every revelation is a grace that feeds our hunger to learn more. But there is also grace in discerning meaningful patterns we cannot fully explain. And sometimes there's grace in being overwhelmed, particularly by a pattern of sound that bypasses our intellect to grab directly at our emotions. We read in a series of delightful disappointments as one sense of the work dies into the resurrection of the next revelation. Iliazd keeps us in motion. The book, as this symposium emphasizes once again, is the closed form that became Iliazd's signature mode of expression, his major art form. I'm going to bring up some images from 65 Maximiliana, or the illegal practice of astronomy, a 1964 collaboration with Max Ernst that has been mentioned numerous times already this weekend, whose Max Ernst's cipher writing you can see, and his vaguely anthropomorphic figures here on the colophon page. This is one of Iliazd's most complex and mysterious performances. The book is based on the 1861 discovery of the asteroid 65 Maximiliana by the German itinerant lithographer and amateur astronomer Ernst Wilhelm Lebrecht Tempel, who struggled to gain his professional colleagues' recognition. Both Anhyd Griet and Françoise Legris have written about the alternations and rhymes in Iliazd's page layouts, his insistence on meter, number, and rhythm at their basis, as for any meaningful work of art. The book has been conceived so that the texts it includes don't actually need to be read for a reader to understand its basic concern, the difficulty of observing and interpreting. Much of the book is given over to Ernst's cipher writing. Here's a good example on this spread that invites us to decode even as we know there's no message. The images in Ernst's engravings are highly suggestive, but they're hard to place. Are they astronomical, mineralogical, marine, living, fossilized? What is figure and what is ground? Iliazd's narration of Tempel's discovery, as we see on this spread, is not laid out in conventional lines. The pattern must be discerned on every page, and this is obvious even if a reader doesn't actually read the story. The book doesn't contain any of Iliazd's poems, but it does include legible texts by Tempel in French, German, and Italian, like these observation notes. Iliazd expressly selected these texts and set them in more or less conventional lines. It strikes me, however, that the book encourages readers to treat even these texts like the cipher writing. The book produces its own concealing effect. Tempel's writings tend to become visual blocks with recognizable generic meanings, like Iliazd's Russian sonnets in the other books. Why should that basic poet's tool, language that advances particular themes, remain hidden in plain view? What happens to our understanding of Iliazd's cosmos when we move to read? Tempel's French and Italian scientific observations describe his efforts to make sense of clouds, auroras, and nebulae, literally nebulous objects. They reinforce what readers have already gleaned from looking. Tempel's art of seeing is the basis for the book, and his research is set low on the page, like foundation stones, as on this page. But what about Tempel's German verses, the bell ringer, pushed to the extreme top margin of the pages that alternate with his research? Tempel's poem depicts a community whose life is regulated by a language of resounding bells, keyed to daily rhythms, but also to fateful moments, births, weddings, deaths, emergencies, and finally revolution, another kind of death and rebirth. The poem unexpectedly shifts readers into another register, not immediately discernible with the eye, the realm of sound and song. This most arrestingly visual of Iliazd's books turns out not just to promote careful visual observation, it encourages active attention to the whole cosmos resonating with the human microcosm within. It opens the realm of emotion, so intimately associated with the effect of Iliazd's early Zaum, his beyond sense. The poet pines for his lost village childhood and longs at the end of the poem for a social world that will vanquish the tyrant death. We realize that this book too is meant to sound, and we suddenly perceive other elements of the book in a new tonality. It changes how we look. Some of Ernst's engravings might register waves and interference patterns representing the sound world. We notice the resonance of images that are repeated on different scales, as they are here in the red and the black. And finally, the expectant emotional charge of Temple's statement of faith on the last page of text rings out, "My stars have helped me up till now. I hope they may help me yet." Those illegible Russian poems help teach us that reading is never done, that reading has many dimensions and that meaning is not always legible. Iliazd's works train us to persevere in the rhythm of resting and rising, because grace shoots through all the world, carried on the music of the spheres. To paraphrase something Iliazd's collaborator Picasso may or may not have said, it has to find you working, but open and listening too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was great. I have to say I was a little taken aback to see the images, the photos I supplied you with. A couple of those were not in good resolution, so I hope I didn't send them that way. I'll supply better copies.
All that anyone needed to see were that there are blocks of text. That's kind of the point there.
Okay, well, we're going to move on to David Zoom's talk. Now, after David's talk, we will have a short break, something like we did yesterday, before we start the last part of our program today, which will be a kind of roundtable discussion, similar to what we did yesterday, but maybe it'll go on a bit longer with all 6 of our symposium presenters. So watch for that. But in the meantime, I believe I can share my screen here and put up David's opening slide title slide before I give him an introduction. So let's try this. David Zoom, our final speaker today, received a PhD from the University of Montreal in 2019. His dissertation, which is titled "The Architectural Nature of the Illustrated Books of Iliazd," has received praise for its deep investigation of the structural properties of Iliazd's work and its comparative analysis of existing scholarship in the field. In the course of his research, he has examined numerous variant copies of Iliazd's books in collections all over the world. And I can't recommend David's dissertation strongly enough for its thorough and original perspective on Iliazd's work. I can't remember, David, if you have it in your up on screen in your presentation today, but I just found it and the link is working. I found it by Googling David Zoom Iliazd, and you have to look for a University of Montreal link. I think it's a papyrus link. So I'm very excited to have David with us today. And please join me in welcoming David Zoom.
Thank you for your very generous introduction. And first, I'd like to say I'm grateful to all the other presentations, starting with Johanna's always incredible presentations. And also, I was surprised but gratified to see Thomas's highlighting of Maximiliana, which I consider probably the masterpiece of Iliazd's books. But today we're going to talk about the Courtisan grotesque. Next, please. Iliazd published 20 deluxe illustrated editions in Paris after his arrival in 1921 and before his death in 1975. The first was a Fat in 1940, and the final was Le Courtisan grotesque in 1974, about which I'm going to talk today. Next. Courtisan is attributed to Adrien de Montluc, a French aristocrat who lived from 1571 to 1646. He managed to attract the malice of Richelieu, who had him imprisoned in the Bastille from 1635 to 1643. Montluc, a grandson of the famous Blaise Montluc, Maréchal of France, probably devoted the majority of his time and effort to his roles as a courtier, military officer, and regional administrator. He was involved in a number of military campaigns during the reigns of Henry IV and Louis XIII. Montluc also maintained broad contacts with intellectuals and writers, and wrote several works under pseudonyms. He was interested in dance and theater, with which he was involved not just as a patron, but also as a performer. Next. This collaboration with the artist Joan Miró was discussed and worked on over a period of years before it was finally published. Iliazd was ill. He would die at the end of the next year, and unable to attend to all the details of its production, as with his other books. Despite his years of working with Louis Barnier of Imprimerie Union, where the texts were printed, and with Jacques Frelot of La Courrière et Frelot, where the engravings were produced, were it not for the dedicated involvement of Iliazd's wife, Hélène, this final edition would not have been possible. Next. Probably the most detailed study of the long history of Courtisan is Françoise Nofarina-Raslovlev's 2005 article in Carnet 6 of the Iliazd Club. She notes that Miró contributed a color engraving to Iliazd's 1949 compilation, Poésie des mots inconnus. Following Iliazd's discovery of Montluc, he produced La Maigre in 1952 with engravings by Picasso. Novarina Raslovlev surmises that Picasso's involvement would have resulted in Miró also wanting to illustrate one of Iliazd's books. She indicates that Iliazd first proposed that Miró illustrate an edition of Courtisan in January of 1951, and continues to detail the successive fits of discussions and interrupted progress until its eventual publication in 1974. It likely seemed that this project would never succeed, like Iliazd's proposal to Matisse in 1947 to design the sets for his ballet, La Chasse Sous-Marine, or his later rebuffed invitation to Chagall to collaborate on a book. Iliazd had, perhaps prematurely, in 1965, expressed his confidence in ultimate success, as cited by Johanna Drucker. Next. In spite of everything, I believe we will finish by making a veritable fireworks of form, colors, and materials. I must note that those of us who write about Iliazd's books often find ourselves citing Johanna. Next. Novarina Raslovlev describes the nature of the text. Per my translation, Le Courtisan grotesque shows unbridled verve and a fantastic imagination, but also literary invention, which suggests Jarry, Lautréamont, the Dadaists, the Surrealists, the Oulipians, and Miró himself. The style of Courtisan is reminiscent of Iliazd's own fictional works, including his 5 early dramas, which were sound-based absurdist theatrical pieces. The dramas preceded Iliazd's awareness of Montluc's texts, while his novels were written afterwards. Next. The suite of brightly colored and ludic full-page engravings by Miró, next, are both dramatically vivid and typically playful. Next. These alternate with a somewhat dense, almost conventionally typeset text in full-page prose blocks, as opposed to the shorter poetic lines of most of Iliazd's books. The lines of text, without exception, rest on the horizontal baselines and extend from the left to the right margins. Of course, Iliazd being Iliazd, there's typographic manipulation of the text. The parenthetical phrases, which were italicized in one of the original editions, were transformed. The individual letters of the words are rotated on their sides. Next. While Miró's engravings contrast with the typography, they correspond well with the content and style of the text. Next. Most of Iliazd's editions were from 50 to 75 copies, but Courtisan consisted of 110 copies. With this last book, in a larger edition, Iliazd apparently had finally exhausted his stocks of vintage Chinese and Japanese papers and printed more than half the copies of Courtisan on contemporary artisanal papers, like the editions of his contemporaries. Next. Courtisan, except for its manipulated typography and obscure text by Montluc, might seem more similar to the lavish deluxe editions produced by Iliazd's predecessor Ambrose Vollard or his contemporaries Aimé Magd or Thériault. I assert, despite this, that with this final book, Iliazd continued the exploration of his unique conception of the illustrated book. While Courtisan was Iliazd's last finished book, I do not believe it was his intended final book, which I agree with Joanna was probably the elegiac Boustrophedon au Miroir of 1971. Next. Vollard, Magd, and Kahnweiler, with his more austere publications, were all art dealers, and their books were a more accessible promotion of their artists. Iliazd did not have similar resources, particularly compared to Vollard, for numerous commissions and lavish productions, and undoubtedly struggled to gradually pay for the expenses of deluxe editions. His books were likely only viable because of the involvement of the artists he had met after his arrival in Paris. Next. I have always focused on the constructions of Iliazd's books, on the interrelations of the manipulated typography and the engravings, the page spreads, the structural units, and the multiple enclosures, rather than any detailed consideration of the poetry or prose texts. My approach has been structural, not literary. Courtisan is composed entirely of a sequence of two grouped folded sheets, one of engravings and one of typeset text. Within two guard sheets, this book consists of 15 sets of two nested folded sheets for a total of 30. The full-page color engravings are numbered 1 to 15 in Roman numerals, and of the 12 sheets, each featuring 2 pages of narrative text, 11 are numbered 4 to 14 for a total of 24 pages. All engravings and printed text appear on a single side of each sheet. This is wonderfully and subtly complicated, however, by the direction of the folds. Next. For my dissertation, I focused on the comparative structures of 4 of Iliazd's books, including Courtisan, as well as Pismo of 1948, Poésie de mots inconnus of 1949, and Chevaux de Minuit of 1956. What made this choice of corpus irresistible for me was that each featured a variation of atypical page foldings. Next. Pismo has either narrow or wider pages. Next. Poésie consists of individually quartered sheets. Next. Chevaux is composed of either 2-panel or 3-panel sheets. Next. Finally, Courtisan features conventional folds, but uniquely alternating fold directions. Of the 4 books, the foldings of Poésie are perhaps the most radical, while those of Courtisan are the most subtle. These books created by Iliazd are distinct from the largely generic editions of others, with their apparently arbitrary conventional structures. Next. The sheets of text are printed with 2 pages on one side, and the sheets of engravings are printed as spreads, also on one side. There is an alternation of engraving facing out on outer sheet and text facing in on inner sheet, and the reverse, type outward and engraving inward. This results in the separation of the 2 pages of text or of engravings when facing outward, and the presentation of spreads of 2 pages of type or entire engravings when facing inward. In effect, all the sheets of Courtisan are printed on rectos, but due to the alternation of fold directions, appear as either rectos or versos. The cumulative effect of the structures of Iliazd's books are the resulting navigational rhythms. Navigating any book involves the punctuation of turning successive pages, but generally both sides of each page bear text and/or illustrations. The navigations of Iliazd's books are prolonged by atypical punctuations. The alternations of the similar two-sheet groupings of Courtisan are both isolated by the intervening blank spreads and emphasized by the contrast of Miró's engravings and the typography of the typeset narrative. That narrative is broken into spreads and single pages with intervening blank spreads and engravings. Next. Iliazd's books can be grouped in multiple overlapping categories. He himself wrote the text for 6 and contributed to 3 others. 12 texts are poetic. 13 include black engravings, while 7 feature color. Picasso entirely provided the engravings for 7 books and contributed to 2 others. One book consists entirely of a suite of engravings, while 3 others feature only a single engraving. 3 of the books have multiple writers and/or artists. As mentioned, 2 of the books featured text by Montluc, Courtisan, and La Maigre, but there was a third that was unrealized using the text L'Infortune des filles de joie, which was attributed at the time to the aristocrat. More recent scholarship does not support Montluc as the author. Michael Kramer omits it from his compilation. Between the 2 published books, Iliazd worked with the artist François Arnauld from 1964 to 1973 on the 3rd book, but it was abandoned. Next. As explored by Antoine Perriot in Carnet 9. Arnauld had produced proofs, next, of color engravings, and Iliazd, next, worked on typographic settings. Next. There are multiple copies of a tantalizing finished proof integrating engraving and text for the first spread. I first saw proofs of the single finished spread and a number of Arnauld's engravings integrated with dummy text at the Iliazd archives in Marseille. When I later returned to the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale, I hoped to find in particular more finished spreads, but unfortunately there were only more copies of the first spread. More recently, I learned that Antoine had located Arnauld's daughter after the artist's death, and once again, hoped for more finished spreads, but this final possibility resulted in only more copies of the first spread. Next. The importance of Montluc to Iliazd is emphasized not only by the 2 published books and the 1 unpublished, but also by 2 others of Iliazd's publications that are related to Montluc and his involvement with dance. First, Traité du Ballet of 1952, with a text by Jehan-François de Boissière, who had been Montluc's secretary, as well as Récit du Nord of 1956, with a transcribed text by René Bordier, which is an extract of invented language from a ballet in which Montluc danced. Montluc is also memorialized in Bousseau-Fédon, Au Miroir, in a poetic stanza. Next. Adrien de Montluc, de Vaux de Cramail, de Soleil, des Chevaliers, de Huitin, de Bastille. That 5 of his 20 painstakingly produced editions, as well as an abandoned book, all relate to Adrien de Montluc, strongly emphasize Iliazd's immense interest in the obscure historical figure. Iliazd stated a number of times, clearly referring to Montluc's circumstances, that the best fate of a poet was oblivion. This is expressed in his preface to La Maigre. Next. Tombé dans l'oubli est le meilleur sort du poète, et Adrien de Montluc a mérité son oubli. It is apparent that Montluc was of great significance to him, and that he probably saw him as a role model for his own artistic endeavors. Montluc was certainly a polymath, a broadly accomplished and connected figure of his time. To the extent that he is known today, it is because of the written works attributed to him, rather than his roles as military officer, regional administrator, and courtier, while they must have occupied the majority of his time and energy. Certainly, Iliazd was more interested in the texts he considered to have been written by Montluc than in his military and administrative experience. Based on the absurdist texts of Courtisan and La Maigre, as well as the invented language of Bousseau-Fédon, Iliazd considered Montluc as a forerunner of contemporary experimental literature. If he overemphasized Montluc's contributions to modernist literature, the most essential role of Iliazd's reconstruction of his life and work is that of the poet consigned to oblivion. The concept of a writer or artist rejected by the mainstream historical narrative was significant to Iliazd because of his focus in bringing to light unoverlooked work, as well as the lack of acceptance for his own writing. Ultimately, it is not of great significance that Iliazd made some mistakes in his research on Montluc, specifically in misattributing a number of works to him due to the confusion among multiple pseudonyms. The absurdist and picaresque narratives that he discovered resonated with his own approach to writing. Beyond his affinity with the texts, Iliazd seems to have seen Montluc as a creative precursor and as a model for his own artistic practice. Despite the large gaps, both of time between the lives of the two men and between their respective positions in society, both took advantage of periods of freedom and experimentation to undertake overlooked creative practices. Next. The Courtisan grotesque, as Iliazd's final expression of his conception of the illustrated book, while perhaps not as daring or challenging or innovative as some might wish, remains one of his utterly distinctive publications, presenting new variations to his idiosyncratic conventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was great. And everyone, please look for David's. Before we end today, I'll put my email address up on screen, so you can send me any questions you might have. We're going to take a break of just a few minutes, and then we will resume. You can get up and stretch and do what you need to do. It'll, similar to yesterday, it'll just be a few minutes. And then, don't forget to send any Q&As you may have for us, any Q's, and we will supply the A's. And we will see you back here in just a few minutes. Okay, and it looks like everybody is back. I hope our audience is still with us. It looks like they are. We are going to take a look at the Q&A tab. And we do have our first question. And panelists, please unmute yourself if you have an answer, raise a hand and I'll recognize you. And we will proceed. I should say that we are joined today also by our presenters from yesterday, Johanna Drucker, Tim Young of the Beinecke, and Kitty Marriott. So we're happy to have everybody with us today. And the first question is from Sarah Halsey in Massachusetts. Sarah says, I am interested in knowing more about the choice of typeface or typefaces that Iliazd used. Gil Sans was mentioned yesterday, and I believe I read in an article by Johanna Drucker that Poésie de mots inconnus used a related French type, bâton, I believe. Did Iliazd ever discuss his choice of these typefaces? And perhaps, Johanna, you'd like to answer that.
Well, I'll say a few things, but I can tell Kitty has a lot to say on this point. I can tell by her laughter. Poésie de mots inconnus is indeed in a little French, a sort of square sans serif called bâton. But then Iliazd did switch over to the Gil Sans and use it for most of the rest of his work. Of course, that wouldn't work for the Russian texts, though he does use that sans serif, as Tom was pointing out on the pages of the Russian text. So, Kitty, I'll leave it to you.
Well, it's a little complicated. So it was my understanding from talking to Michael Caine, who knows about early French type, that baton is actually a generic name for that style of type rather.
Okay.
And so he said that it really was Gil Sans. And so what I haven't done is actually blow it up and look at it next to the Gil Sans that he used later. So
It's not Gil Sans. It doesn't have the elegance of Gil. I mean, the Gil is so, articulate, really. And the baton is kind of chunky and square. It doesn't have the variations at all that make the Gil so subtle. But, I'm sure he's right that it's a generic name. It's like calling something sans serif, right? Baton is a particular font. So. But I think Iliazd really, again, what's interesting is given how much he played with different fonts in the Zaum works, right? That then once he moves into his mature work, he finds a font he wants to work with, and then he can really use it. In other words, he knows it so well that he can kind of decide what color to make it on the page, how to use it in all the ways that you demonstrated yesterday. So I think, I don't know, I'd be curious to know what David and others think, but I think, that was, it became a language for him that he could really vary in all kinds of subtle ways.
yeah, I agree. That's what he used. And it was his language, his vocabulary, as I mentioned before. And, throwing the letters on the side, he would know after a while how many pieces of metal that he'd have to stick in there. So to be a lot easier, he really simplified his life. He simplified the layouts using that font because it was so, without serifs, without fussiness, it was so straightforward. It served his purpose to be a little bit invisible in terms of the shapes of the letter forms so that the message could come through.
I would also suggest maybe that that Le Dentieux is something of a one-off when it comes to the typography, where he uses that explosion of different fonts. The earlier draws, the earlier Zaum draws are much more restrained, and the innovation in typography tends to serve the vocal purposes, some kind of an oral purpose. It's keyed like a score. And Le Dentieux has that part too. All of those ranged choruses are much more like the earlier ones. And there's the sense that with Le Dentieux, there's a crisis for Iliazd wondering how will he interest these people in Paris who don't read Cyrillic, don't read Russian? How will he provide visual interest for them? And he never really goes back to that same kind of explosion of fonts. So Le Dentieux is very strange in that.
Yeah, I mean, he does a little bit of experimentation with orchestral verse and the separation of voices. And
that's right, he does, but that's very restrained in terms of. It's
very restrained. You're totally right. Yeah.
I have a question for you all, and I saw in the 1987 MoMA catalog for the Iliazd show, and I don't remember if it was in Audrey Isselbacher's essay or in Francoise Legree's. Somebody remarked that Iliazd's use of all caps, all capital letters, related somehow to the idea that ecclesiastic texts in the Republic of Georgia were set in all caps. Consulting my friend Clifton Metter, who's a typographer and had a Fulbright in the Republic of Georgia, Cliff says that there is no difference between capital letters. There's no uppercase and lowercase in the Georgian typography. Does anybody have anything to say about that?
I think that Iliazd certainly got in visual influence from medieval manuscripts. I mean, there's the manuscript that I showed from this text by Constantine of Preslav, just the kinds of practices that medieval scribes would use with different colors, different ways of keying you to particular parts of the page that don't necessarily have to do with reading along the line, other ways of moving around the page. So whether it's manuscripts that are in Cyrillic or manuscripts that are in Georgian or even, I'm sure, Western manuscripts as well. That's, to me, that's clearly something that he was keyed to.
I think he started using the technique of interchanging in his draws, precisely because in each of the draws, the capital letter is the one letter in the sentence that is under stress. So it's very easy to read even the Zaum because he suggests where the stress falls in any particular word. While the majority of the text of the draws is not capitalized, it's regular letters, unless he starts playing with the typefaces, like in Le Dentu. Nevertheless, keeping, even when he uses the capital letters, keeping the one where the stress falls definitely bigger than the other capitalized letters.
Can I just point out that the best essay I know on the typography of the typography of Iliazd is in the Carnet number 9, where you must know this, Mikhail Karasik's essay on les 5 pièces typographiques d'Ilia Zdanévich, the, sort of 5 kind of moves or whatever, typographic moves of Ilia Zdanévich. And it's a beautiful essay. So it's in Carnet number 9 of the Carnet of the Iliazd Club. So I think it's a terrific study and very careful reading of the typographic moves that Iliazd makes sequentially, Andrei, building on what you're saying. So.
Right.
Well, we have a new question from Ivan Sokolov. He asks, he says, just curious, when does his work start to get translated into French? I mean, I do get the allure of a text in a foreign language and unknown alphabet. Plus, there's always the surely theatrical behavior of the poet. The things he says and writes in his talks and essays to make up for the lack of familiarity with Iliazd's work for his Parisian comrades. But were there any more direct links?
Direct links in what sense? Biographically or?
Well, you would have to ask Ivan.
I'm sure Ivan will clear it, but
yeah.
He was in as soon as he was introduced to Zara and Picabia, he was in constant contact with them. And it lasted until this La Soirée de Coeur là-bas, and during all the night balls and fêtes, right? He meets Picasso at the Fête de la Nuit, and then he meets more people, and Andrei, who actually draws the poster from Zdanevich's design for Fête de la Nuit. And he stays in contact with them more than he stays in contact with his Russian comrades in arms, especially after 1925. The Lidantu Faram wasn't translated into French immediately. However, when it came out in 1923, it had a separate brochure with the preface written by Raymond Dessein in French, which basically retells, or at least tries to retell the plot, the narrative of how Lidantu is envisioned by Zdanevich. It explains to any type of possible readers more about this draw that Zdanevich, I think, intended in his own text. As far as the translations in French go, I do not know when they started translating. I don't think that any of them were translated into French until he started publishing the books. And that's when he started publishing them in French more than he did in Russian. So there is typographically, so to say, or in his bibliography, there is a big gap between the time he publishes Les Dentus and then he starts writing Afat and starts publishing the books, right at the turn of the 1940s.
Yeah, Ivan came back on and said, he's talking about readers reading his poems, and he says, was any one of those people in Paris ever able to read Iliazd's poetry in Russian?
You know, Thomas will know this, but Thomas, in Rael, isn't there a French translation of those two sonnets?
Iliazd helped to translate it, and it's
in the book.
Yeah, in the book.
And then, you know, he wrote the novels in Russian, but he, you know, look, his father was a French professor. He grew up speaking French, so
apparently he didn't. That's right. Apparently he didn't feel that he was capable of doing the translation himself, but with Rapture, for instance, he hired Valentin Parnach, apparently, to make a French translation, and Parnach did a lot of translation in music criticism in the late 20s. But then Parnach went back to the Soviet Union before it was done, so it didn't happen. That's the only case that I know of in that early period where there was a concerted effort to translate something into French. And then, like you said, with Rahel, there's this overlay. And then with
Kuzmo, there's a whole story about the relationship with Olga. And yes, for whom should I write in Russian? And she says, for me. And there's a whole kind of, you know, sort of poignancy there, I think, about he felt the loss of writing in Russian and felt it was kind of pointless to write in Russian in this French context. And yet the idea of writing this poem in Russian was a kind of homage to her and their connection with each other. And so I think there's a lot of emotion around it too.
Absolutely. And then with Peter Smanashvili, Andrei Dubouché helps to translate that from his 1914 article to the 1970 publication. I mean, clearly, once he started this late work with these deluxe books, he was making a lot more contacts with a newer generation of Russian poet or French poets as well. I don't know of really concerted efforts to translate his work into French until after his death. So like you were talking about Andrei Markovich yesterday, who has, I just want to lift this up.
It just came out, right?
Just came out, yeah. So
fabulous.
So if you're a French reader and you want to read the poetry, Andrei has done over the last almost 40 years, has done a significant portion of
That's right. This book was first announced in 1984. So it's a big deal that it's you know, out by now.
Andrei is a poet, so I mean Andrei's inhabitation of Iliazd's language has a really I mean I can only hear it. I mean I can read the French, but I mean Andrei and Tom, you can speak to that, but Andrei Markowitz is truly a poet in the way that he.
There's no doubt about that. Absolutely, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, but he's also a great translator, you know,
yes.
because he translated Pushkin and you into French, and that was a big deal. So to answer the question about French, however, that Iliazd many times admitted that his French was really poor. That's in effect how his first lecture starts out. However, he was extremely, extremely powerful in explaining his work, his poetry. For example, in letters to Tristan Zara, or Francis Picabia, his famous letter to Francis Picabia, where he basically tries to convey to him the gist of what his artistic work, his literary work is all about. So I don't think that anyone tried to read it just because nobody really tried to read Dada thoroughly or seriously. It was more known for the ephemera, for their slogans, rather than the poetic work, which was, and that drove, for example, Andrei Breton nuts, because Breton really wanted to have a very serious, very organized literary movement, and Zara will not stand for it, or Picabia for that matter. And so with Zdanevich, it was the same case, because they would receive l'ident tu le fais, right, with as an objet d'art, more than a literary book that needs to be read, scrutinized, or memorized, or whatever it might be. They would just look at this as the art object. And I think that was a brilliant approach.
Can I just say also that one of the things that's so distinctive about Iliazd, and this might be evident to us on the panel, but might not be evident to all of the listeners, is that while Dada did a lot, the Dada poets did a lot of, graphical experimentation, Zara, but also, many others, none of them made a sustained book. In other words, they were all ephemeral things. They were a single page poem.
Absolutely.
Right? The only book length work that's typographically innovative up through that period is the Marinetti, the Zhang Tun. Marinetti didn't do that book himself, right? He may have contributed to the thoughts about it, but the thing that makes Iliazd special is he thinks in typographic terms. And I think his whole kind of relationship between composition and exposition are interlinked formally and graphically. But I want to go back to what Tom was saying about Maximiliana, because Tom, I'm so appreciative of your subtle and careful reading of that book, which has also always been one of my favorites. And which is, it's not the beloved book of everyone. And you were at that conference in Paris where we heard it, treated, and Kitty, you were too, where we heard it treated as if it were merely a commodity for an audience, for consumers. It was made like a product. I so don't agree. And I think, Tom, you're really bringing something that pulls all this together in a way that I totally agree with, which is, this is a book about signification. It's about the visuality of writing. It's about, the intersection, the interpenetration of the visual and the verbal. It's about signs. It's about reading. It's about, we could go through a long inventory of these things. And I think it ties, to David's reading of the physical form as well. Again, it's like these things can't be separated for Iliazd. He conceptualizes books as wholes and integrates, each aspect of the tactile, the visual, the structural, the compositional, and the poetic.
And that's why he talks in his first lecture in Paris immediately about the typography of calligrams. He misses on actually seeing La Prost Transsibérienne presented in Moscow, in Petersburg, in the Strait Dog Cabaret in December 1913. And his first draws, well, they're typographically nothing special, because it just, the capital S letter in the middle where the stress falls and nothing else. And then as soon as he arrives in Paris, he suddenly is empowered by this comparison with Apollinaire's calligrams, having L'Union right next door where Romov brings him, and publishing finally publishing the way that he always envisioned, I think. And that's why he didn't write any more draws after l'ident tu le fais, because that was like the epitome of his approach to typography, at least in Russian, or in his own Russian oeuvre, so to say.
Could I just mention something while we're talking about Maximiliana? I mentioned yesterday that the archives at MoMA might contain some of the maquettes from Maximiliana, because I read that in Nisselbacher, but I went back and checked that to make sure that I was right about that. And apparently that is, she was indicating that there was a private collection that they showed at the exhibit. So it didn't belong to MoMA.
Wow.
Bibliothèque Nationale had some also, but I don't know who has that collection of maquettes for Maximiliana. But I do have a question to ask of David, actually. So David, in your research, have you ever, you said that there were multiple editions of Le Courtisan grotesque. Have you ever seen like the first one? And do all of the editions have the italicized words? And why, do you know why about every third or fourth word, words are italicized in the original text?
It's at least one edition I remember without having, details in front of me, the descriptions of editions in front of me. Random words I'm not certain about. It was to, in that edition, it was to indicate parenthetical remarks as far as it's my understanding.
Iliazd said they were puns.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of code that we can't get now that has to do with words. Like, remember, Kitty, the very first page, you were looking at Desbois, and you said, why is Desbois turned sideways? Well, what's the reference for Desbois within a contemporary context? Remember that Montluc had gotten into trouble with Richelieu. I mean, that's the apocryphal tale, is that Richelieu establishes the French Academy in order to have legitimate grounds to exclude Montluc. Right. So he's an outlaw of language. So, I mean, I don't know if these tales are true. I'm just reporting, what I know. So I think we can't know, like, was there a figure who was known as Desbois, the way that, someone is referred to as the blob, or the yellow Julius, or the orange Julius, or, in other words, I think that Montluc's satires had within them various caricatures of contemporary figures. And the books are very hard to find, the Montluc books.
Yeah, I wondered if subsequent editions continued with the italicizing of those words, if David had seen more than one edition.
I don't specifically recall, like I say at the moment, without having the descriptions in front of me.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry.
Well, David, while you were here, I wonder if you could say something about architecture, and specifically maybe the Le Corbusier book, Le Poème de l'Angle droit. And I think probably Le Corbusier's only artist book. We are fortunate to have a copy of that in the Logan collection, so I'm familiar with it. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about architecture and the structure of Iliazd's books.
Well, the indication is that Le Corbusier was a friend of Léger's, and he saw Léger's beautiful book that he did for Thériade earlier in 1950, I think, because I believe that Le Poème de l'Angle droit is 1955. And so, but this, and of course, this wasn't conceived of structurally in any way by Thériade. He just gave a commission. And so, and Le Corbusier ran with it in particular because he was sort of expressing his philosophy of architecture and life. So these were texts he had probably been working on for a considerable period of time. And then I really consider Le Poème de l'Angle droit pretty much the only deluxe illustrated edition comparable in any way to any of Iliazd's books, just because it was conceived structurally entirely by Le Corbusier and executed by him too. He did the handwritten text, which was what Thériade was particularly known for, the books with handwritten text, and then did the drawings, and then the separate single sheet full color lithographs, and with an index at the beginning and the end. So that it was really kind of extraordinary, and I think it's just a beautiful book, and I'm so glad that I think Katje Hans, the Dutch publisher, there's a reduced format. The Le Corbusier Foundation put out a larger format, but still reduced bound facsimile a few years ago, which is kind of expensive now. I mean, not like Iliazd's books, but for a conventional printed book, an art book, and but there is a new edition which fortunately isn't reduced to insane smallness like the latest reproductions of Matisse's
Jazz, yeah.
Yeah. Which is so tiny. It's like ridiculous. You need a loop to look at it.
Yeah. Well, this one
Yeah.
is pretty small.
Yeah. That's really a gorgeous book. Outside of Iliazd's books, that's one of my favorite books.
Yeah.
Just because I think it's so beautiful.
Yeah.
And because of its structure, which is so atypical. Because I mean, you look at the deluxe editions and they're arbitrary. It's just like, throw this here, throw this there, blah blah blah. It's just, they're just sort of, let's put this stuff all together somehow or other.
Yeah.
And there's no underlying conception, much less ongoing experimentation. Like with each book, he did variations. Anyway. So yeah, that's an extraordinary book. I mean, as far as the Le Corbusier angle, I mean, although I adore that book, I had to have a theoretical angle for my dissertation. So that's why I don't anticipate pursuing, the passage architectural further with regards to Iliazd's books. Although I thought it fit, I thought it was legitimate. A case could be made. So
in terms of typography, we should also not forget Vasily Kaminsky's Tango with Cows. Which was, a very remarkable work and has had a wonderful new facsimile produced and with a translation in the facsimile. So it's, and that was what, 1912, is it 19? Yeah, I think it's, I'll get the date wrong because I always do. I think it's 1912.
That's all right. The 1912, 1913.
Thanks, Andrei.
I don't think it's really established.
So there. Here's the cat that you brought up yesterday about connections to English circles, and I know today Andrei mentioned Iliazd's attempt to have one of his early lectures, was it a lecture that was translated? He was trying to have it translated into English and published in the Little Review.
Yes, that's right. Well, it was his. Sorry to interrupt. It's an essay that he wrote, the introduction to the catalog of Larionov Goncharov exhibition in New York. Yeah.
So yeah, and I was thinking. So that was something I didn't know about, but when you brought the question up yesterday, Johanna, I was just sketching down notes of things that I know, and there seem to be all these kind of tenuous things. For instance, in Poésie, there's Eugène Zola is there, right? So there's a connection to transition through that somehow, but it's unclear, how strong that connection would be, or his muse, I guess, for a thought was an English model, but apparently they're, again, somebody that he met through his French friends. And while he was working for Chanel, he was involved in setting up factories in England for her to make woolens and things like that. So, one wonders at the time whether he tried to make any contacts, but it seems like that's a moment in the late 20s and early 30s when, as Andrei was talking about, he kind of had stepped back from all of the artistic world for the most part. And his address book, I seem to remember, includes James Joyce. When he first comes to Paris and starts collecting addresses, James Joyce is among the ones that he collects. I have no idea whether he ever tried to establish contact, but
there's no evidence that he did. I mean, the main thing that I'm working on, Tom, is the fact that the collection of authors in Poetry of Unknown Words doesn't include a single Anglophone sound poet experimenter. And Joyce, I mean, a passage from Joyce would have been an obvious choice, but there are others. And so I just found that I just think it's interesting. I mean, Andrei would know more about the cultural context that may have divided those domains socially.
I haven't. Is the address book published? Is it available anywhere, or it's just?
I don't remember off the top of my head where I saw that.
I've never seen it.
I haven't heard about his contacts with. I mean, Joyce is usually associated with, while he's in Paris, he's associated with Sylvia Beach, right?
I mean,
Right,
Stein would
Sylvia
have been
Beach,
the
the Shakespeare and
obvious person.
Company. However, Iliazd was, he knew the first Joyce translator into French. The person who translated Joyce into French for the first time was Russian. And actually my co-author and dear friend Leonid Levak wrote a book about her. And so it might have been some coincidence, but I don't have any documentary proofs. But then again, I never worked in Iliazd's archives in Marseille, so maybe. But there are all these little pages, you know, and that I know from the late Marzo Marzaduri, who was the one initiating the work on the archive back I think in the early 70s. That the archive was just a pile of different papers where some unexpected things could pop up. And so I hope it will be available, you know, all this information will come at some point and will be known, and it will shift a perspective on at least his biography and his circle of friends in Paris.
For the Chavot book, I've been looking for a translation of Roche-Gray, the Baroness's poem. And has anyone seen such a thing, or do we have to try to find someone to do it? And I would like to see the form of her poem. I assume all of the typographic extravagance is Iliazd's.
I assume that too, because he was working off the graphic forms in the Picasso plates. And I mean, I don't think Picasso would have copied from a manuscript text. My guess is that Picasso's movements of the horse and their bodies is what gave Iliazd the inspiration for the setting. Kitty, what do you, well, David, you're the one who knows. You've looked at this quite extensively.
That was my impression as well. I mean, you know, Ilias was responding to the legs, upturned legs, and different things. Yeah,
because that's what he does so beautifully with the, you know, Haussmann. Poème et Bois is fantastic that way. So
there's one passage where she talks about a thunderstorm coming in the poem, and Iliazd arranges it visually. It's looks like a beautiful passage from my very rough translation in Google Translate that I came up with. But I'd love to see the original and a translation.
I have a question, maybe Johanna or David, both of you, because David, you mentioned that Iliazd was ill when he was trying to finish Courtisan, and you knew Helene, Johanna. So do you know exactly what Helene did? How did she help him finish the book? Were the maquettes already done and therefore it was just a matter of getting things to finish, or what did she do?
my understanding was that she went to the shop. She went both to the atelier and to the print shop, and that she was ferrying things back and forth. I don't think Iliazd was capable of going to either shop at that point. So I think she was sort of his eyes and ears in the production, and then would bring him proofs and so forth. But David, you may have a better idea.
That was my understanding, that she was intensively involved with all aspects of the production, including I think she visited Miró to take him some materials or copies of the book.
Right.
So yeah,
she didn't do any design
it
work.
Couldn't have happened without her, because Iliazd couldn't do all these things.
Exactly. She never was, involved in the hands-on design work or production work.
I just noticed that Francois Méret is with us in the audience, and he has just indicated on that he has raised his hand. So Francois, if you're still listening, what you need to do is go to the Q&A panel and type in a comment or an observation or a question for us, And we will, I'll pay attention to see if you do that. And when you do, it would be great to have you as part of this conversation. Meanwhile,
You might say something about the Iliazd Club now that we're talking about Francois. Steve.
Here, Francois says, my mother went to Mallorca many times. That's his comment. I don't remember what that relates to here. But that's
Well, it was to visit Miró, the publication of Courtisan.
Yeah, and Rich just messaged me that we can allow Francois to speak if we would like. And yes, please, Rich, let's do that. It would be great for Francois to be here, and so we'll see if he pops up here in our presenter screen. And
Can you show me?
there he is. Yes.
Hello.
Bonjour François, comment ça va?
Ça va, et vous?
Très bien.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. You see me? No? No.
Not quite. Pas encore.
Thank you for staying up late for us. It's very late for you.
I want to say some different things about Le Dentue. It shows, you heard me?
Oui.
Yeah. About Le Dentue, it shows that the book was prepared in Constantinople, and that when Ilias arrived in Paris, it was ready to be printed. Because we have documents. This year in Constantinople is really very, very important, and nobody take care a lot until recently, and thanks to Thomas and Valentina to have the idea to work on this, and also to Sergei Kuzyachev. He did a great job about this time, this period, and he's still working on this. And we are still discovering information. We know now that Ilias came to Constantinople first time before his stay, before his 1 year stay. We don't know why and what to do, but he went there. But so the Dentue was prepared. And also, so for Miró, my mother helped Ilias to end the book. But sure, the book is an Ilias book, because I remember to have seen Ilias in the years 70, 72, 3, 4 to work on the project. It was this book. So my mother was one of my cousins. They end the book, they bind the book, but under Ilias supervision. And without my mother, it shows that this book had never been ended. And Miró was very kind with her and with Ilias to end the book.
For those of us, for those of you in the audience, you may not know that Francois is Ilias's stepson. He is Hélène's son, and that he is in charge of Ilias's archive. And he's been
a part of Ilias's archive.
Yes, and he's been so helpful to us. It's so great to have you part of this conversation.
We have nothing concerning Joyce in the archives. I've never seen any book, nothing in the archive with Joyce. Never heard about it.
Yeah.
Okay, they could have still known each other, at least through Ludmila Savitskaya.
But he met so many people, so.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I will be very pleased to meet you because you know many things about concerning Ilias, and you must come if you are coming to France. We will be pleased to welcome you in the archives also.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'll be honored. As soon as this nonsense is over, perhaps.
Yeah, not a good time now.
Going back to an earlier question, of all the painters Iliazd worked with, as far as I know, only Chagall, of course, would have been able to read his poetry and to read his books in Russian. But I don't really know anything about the relationship. I know Chagall participated in the Poésie de mon Inconnu, but not in another book that Iliazd did. Can anyone say anything about that?
I do know one thing. I couldn't find the citation quickly enough. It's in one of the catalogs, I think, at the Megd Foundation when it was inaugurated. I forget the year, in the 60s, I think. Iliazd was there, Chagall was there, and Iliazd tried to charm Chagall into agreeing to do an edition with him. And he said, when I'm 100. So that was a bit of a put off. And of course, neither of them he didn't make it, neither did Iliazd. So that's the only reference I have seen regarding a meeting of the two. Although, of course, Chagall did contribute the engraving to Poésie.
Yeah, it was at the Mag Gallery in Saint-Paul-de-Vence, and it was for Miró 80th birthday or Chagall 80th birthday. And they met together. Sure, at this time it was the answer of Chagall. But after, Iliazd came sometimes to Vence to see Chagall. He was working in a chapel, and I remember my mother saying, "We are going to Vence to see Chagall." For other painters, I have no, except Picasso, sure, but for the other, and Ernst, Max Ernst, they were very close friends, and he was going to this, I don't remember, a small city by...
it starts with an S.
But he went there many times to see Max Ernst. They were very, very close friends. Very, very good relation together.
I just wanted to ask a question, Steve, if anybody knows about Afat and how, because the poems, the sonnets in Afat were all written in Russian, and Iliazd had asked Picasso to illustrate it, so to speak. Did he verbally tell him about these love sonnets so that he could make imagery? I mean, does anybody know about that relationship? Or did Picasso just know, oh, it's about love? And so he made his figures, Does anybody know about that in this group, or Francois?
No. The only thing we know is that the 10 first copy are dedicated to many women. And what's her name? Joan
Spencer.
So, and Joan Spencer. Joan Spencer, we have a small Iliazd portrait by Joan Spencer. And what I have it at home, it's a very small one. And I turn it for the first time, and we read, and handwritten by Iliazd. Joan Spencer is La Petite Anglaise, painted by a painter who was painting a piece of meat sometimes.
Soutine.
Soutine, that's right.
Soutine.
Soutine. So Joan Spencer was La Petite Anglaise, portraited by Soutine, and nobody knows that. And they were very, very close during years 38, 37, 38, 39. It was very bad time for Iliazd. And Joan Spencer wrote, "Do you remember this good time we had?" And after she became a countess in Paris. married the count, the rich count in Paris.
Thomas, wouldn't Serge Farah have been able to read Rael?
Oh, I mean, there were clearly people in the circle,
Yeah.
and some who were receiving books from Iliazd who would have been able to read.
Right.
But I think
I'm
the
just
vast
thinking of
majority-
collaborators. Yeah.
Yeah,
Surage as well.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I didn't know also, Andrei, you mentioned this publication of Rahel too in the newspaper. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, well, it was a lucky find, because
Yeah,
it was really nothing. And then it's a very peculiar newspaper because they started publishing in the spring of 1945 after Paris was freed, but before the victory, right? The victory of Allies was actually announced. And that was a newspaper that was published by, by a bunch of poets it also had a very strange underside because they were actually doing their own, what is called l'épuration, bringing out in the Russian community, announcing who was collaborating with the Nazis during the occupation. And then after the Allied victory was announced in May, there was an immediate shift, in how Chestnut Sloan was being published, because it became more artistic and more open, and but never reached this stance of a pro-Soviet newspaper in Paris like many others. So Soviet Patriot and what was it? The News of the Day, I think it was called, the Советские Патриоты, Новости Дня, two more Russian newspapers that were published in Paris at the same time, because all the big newspapers that were so important in the interbellum period, like Последние новости and Возрождение, La Renaissance, and the current news, they ceased their publication. And the Honest Elephant was basically the first Russian newspaper that started being published right after the war. And I was extremely surprised to find that, and I only knew of those poems from the book with Surage that was designed by Surage, and would have never imagined that there would be a publication of Iliazd after this break with Russian emigrants. Yeah. So Bozhnev also appeared in this newspaper. He published actually a wonderful poem called The Allegory of Victory. And then they started publishing the Soviet poets, for example, Anna Akhmatova, there as well. So it's an interesting thing that requires more attention, I think. But the relationship of Zdanevich, his relations with the mainstream Russian emigre press or Russian emigres in general is not yet studied very well, because you can find the reviews on Le Dantu in the newspapers where you would never expect to find them, including Последние новости, or the announcement of his lectures in the University of 41st degree, which are printed verbatim how he gave them. And I made a couple of translations for my talk, but I cut them out because it was too expensive. But I would really ask you to consider, Thomas, in your list of projects in translating Iliazd, his speech, celebratory speech for the Pushkin's anniversary. I wanted to read my quick translation, then I got embarrassed. So, but I'll be happy to send you the text.
I've done a quick translation of that because when we were organizing a thing here at Columbia, we discovered it in someone else's archive. It wasn't with anything that had to do with Iliazd. Somebody apparently had attended the celebration, and Iliazd and friends or someone had been standing outside handing out mimeographed
This leaflet.
copies.
And
of
if
the
I'm not
speech.
mistaken, it's actually in the archives of Shervashidze. Just like many other flyers of Iliazd, Count Shervashidze, one of the famous stage designers who also worked with Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, and whom Zdanevich contacted immediately when he came to Paris, because besides trying to fit into the emigre circles with the help of Larionov and Goncharova, he immediately also brought up his Caucasian connections. So Georgy Ivangulov, a poet, Shervashidze, painter, Lado Gudiashvili, and a few others. Well, it's brilliant because I think it's such a great speech. It's so subversive, and also describes Iliazd himself, as a very jovial, short Don Juan.
Yeah.
So I would have expected that it would be a great idea for one of the masquerades that Zdanevich would dress up like Pushkin, because he was the same height, right? But he never went that far, although other futurist poets did. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Well, we could wrap up soon. We have still another hour in our time frame, but this has been a great conversation so far. So please, we can have a bit of dead air to wait for someone to start up another thread in the meantime. Any other questions?
I don't know. I felt like yesterday in answering a question about Ilya's involvement in current events, and I mentioned that he dedicated poesy to all of his kind of fallen comrades, and kind of forgot to mention the foremost among them, who is his second wife, Ronke Akinsemoyen. And I think this is one of the great things here in poesy, where design coincides with chance. So her name happens to be first in the alphabetical order of all of the poets that he includes in the book. He gets to put her poem first of all. And for those who don't know, she was a Nigerian princess who was studying in Paris, and she was interned in a camp as a British subject, and contracted tuberculosis, and she died soon after she got out of the camps at the end of the war. So that was sort of one of his foremost dedicatees for that collection.
And her page has the illustration by Matisse.
By Matisse.
Which I think is maybe the only time Iliazd was able to get a Matisse illustration.
That's right? Another of these stories about the tricky relationship between Iliazd and the Russian community, where he had planned a ballet, a Zaum ballet, in the late 1940s, and apparently got Matisse's his agreement to do set designs for it. But then it was announced publicly that, oh gosh, now the name is slipping my mind, the famous choreographer, Serge Liffard, that Serge Liffard would be doing the choreography, which Iliazd claims was never his intention, but Liffard was a known collaborator during the occupation. And that crashed the whole project. So Matisse then was persuaded by others, Zara and others, not to participate in that, and that came apart. So they never worked together after that. I believe he was also, it was also intended at one point that Matisse would do images for the wordless sentence, the sentence sans parole, but he died before that was completed. So.
To add to what just Thomas said, it's worth mentioning that Brigadny, the brigadier, right, Thomas? That's how you translated it. The poem was also dedicated to the memory of those who didn't survive the camps, right? Тех памяти, кто не вышел из лагерей. And I think it not only meant the ones who were interned, like his, like Zdanevich's second wife, but it's also those who died in the Gulag, whether it was Igor Terentiev, his Tiflis collaborator, who managed to organize, who was a theater director and a dramaturg, playwright himself, but he also managed to organize a theater in the Gulag, in Magadan. And but also Serge Romov, who in 1929 went back to the Soviet Union and wasn't allowed to leave. He thought that he would only go for a little time and will work there at the new magazine called the International Literature, but he wasn't allowed to leave and also disappeared in the camps after this.
And Vladimir Sveshnikov is another
Of course.
who died in.
Yes, thank you for mentioning him. He was really, important.
Here I am.
Ah, you're back.
Also for Brigadny, translation is un de la brigade in French. My mother printed it with Anya Stareski, which was a close friend to Iliazd, from Iliazd. And Brigadny is also dedicated to the Spanish refugees, Spanish people who left suddenly Spain when Franco came, right? And they were not jailed, but put in camps in bad conditions in the years 1939, 37, 39, yeah. And also part of the poem is dedicated to them also. Again. But his brother was also in camp, and Kirill. So,
Okay, I'm waiting. Are we satisfied that we've covered a lot of ground today and yesterday, for that matter? If there is anything more anyone would like to add, I don't see new questions have come in to us on the Q&A panel. Yes.
Yeah, I would just like to end on a kind of more upbeat note. I mean, I think these comments about, the fallen comrades and, the, substance seriousness of what Iliazd lived through in his life are very, very important. But I think one thing that's really interesting to think about at this point going forward is, the point at which I began to engage with the work of Iliazd, when again, there were just a handful of people who were really publishing about his work. I mean, he was collected and curators knew his work, and, private collectors as well as institutional ones. But that it's been extremely enheartening in the last few years to see the kind of work that people are doing at the finer grained level. I mean, the work that Thomas is doing, for instance, with Valentina on Constantinople. I mean, there was just no way to get access to that information at the time I was working with Iliazd. The kind of attention to the expeditions, to the work in the Caucasus, that wasn't work that we had access to. That the kind of careful reading and study of these works that, Kitty with her students and Dave David with his formal analysis. I mean, this kind of engagement with Iliazd's work, Andrei's work on the kind of political and social contexts, you know, the work that Tim presented yesterday on even the whole sort of problem of finding materials because of, you know, name authority files and so forth, that it's just been, you know, really encouraging to see the kind of, you know, careful return to finding, you know, areas of Iliazd's work that haven't been attended to and bringing them forward for careful reading and careful attention. And, you know, again, I go back to François Legris, but also the wonderful work of François Chapon, without which we wouldn't have the start points for the bibliographies, and Lionel Marie. You know, the men, and of course, Andrei Markovits and Régis Guéraud, these people who really, you know, at a point when there wasn't any kind of framework in particular, did the founding work that has let those of us who came after to build on it and, you know, kind of leaving bits of traces. So I just, you know, as we're closing up, I just would like to really acknowledge both the predecessors who put a foundation in place, but really acknowledge what the kind of excitement that we saw in the Columbia conference last year and the conferences in Paris that Thomas and helped organize, and Kitty was there and others, and Boris Friedman's incredible work, and just that it's really gratifying to see this work. And there's the paradox of the fact that, you know, Iliazd made that statement that the best fate that can befall a poet is to fall into oblivion. And he got his wish for a while, but, you know, how would he feel, you know, now to have all of this kind of attention to these many, many details? And I think he would be gratified. And I know Hélène would be, because she worked so hard to be sure that his work would, you know, not fall into oblivion, but would find this kind of attention. So I just want to say that as a closing note.
I think that's
Brilliant.
exactly the equivocal nature of that statement about the best fate is oblivion. I mean, it always leaves open the possibility of discovery, right? That's the, you know, I've waited while alive, I'll wait to last.
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
wait immortal, I'll wait for all time. It doesn't matter. It's like, so it's, it's discovery, and that's something that Iliazd loved so much. All kinds of discovery, and now there are people all over the world working in different languages.
Yeah. Well, Johanna, I can't help but believe that your book is going to have an impact. Is there anything you want to say about it and about your hopes for it?
You know, I hope it will, you know, fulfill the karmic debt I feel to Hélène. That's for sure. She was such an incredible, you know, person to know and to work with, as well as the people in the circle around her. And so, you know, it has really weighed on me for years to not have completed that project. And, you know, and I do think it's a much richer story now than it was when I wrote it 30 years ago, when I really was just describing the man and his work. And I sent Hélène the manuscript in 1991 that I had completed. And I could tell she was disappointed. She wrote back to me and she said, well, it's not a novel, is it? And I thought, you know, but it was a very telling comment, because what she was really saying was, you know, how do we make the life alive? How do we make the experience alive? How do we make something someone can enter into? Now, I cannot create Iliazd's life for someone to walk into and experience, because I did not know him, but I can recreate the experience of discovering him and the incredible, you know, sort of, you know, experience of meeting these people who had known him, and of course of working with Hélène. So that's the novel, you know, not the novel of Iliazd's life, but the novel of the research itself, as something, was so exciting. And again, I think as Thomas is saying, the thing about falling into oblivion that Iliazd himself understood was the joy of discovery, which was why he was so thrilled with Adrien de Montluc and, some of these other figures who he said, these are people who wrote Zaum before the fact, and I think, so that's what I would say about the book, and also to acknowledge that without Kitty Marriott constantly at me for the last, decade saying, you have to get that Iliazd book done. There are many people to whom I owe many debts of whether they're gratitude or something else. I just say thank you. We'll see how the book goes.
So is it out already, or?
No, Andrei, it's coming out in December. We had hoped we'd have it for the symposium, but it's not. I don't even have an advance.
Congratulations.
Copy.
I
can't
checked
even hold
the
up a
website.
little teaser.
The website says it's on the back order, so I thought that it was already out, and there are no copies left.
No, but Hopkins was wonderful to work with, and I have to say the editor I had on that project was the best editor I've ever had. He was truly wonderful. So anyway.
Congratulations. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
It's a great thing. This symposium has been a great thing. It's so good to be with you all for 2 days. I know I have learned so much. And as we close, Rich, I am going to put my email address up on the screen for anyone who has any comments or questions about the symposium or wants to know where they can order at a discount a pre-publication price for Johanna's book when it is released in December. And once again, thank you all. This has been
Thank you.
so great.